The story does not begin with explosions over European cities or soldiers storming beaches. It begins in silence, inside offices where paper mattered more than gunfire. Ledgers were opened, columns were filled, decisions were signed in ink, not blood. Across the British Empire, clerks tracked numbers that would decide the outcome of a global war. We are taught that Britain survived World War II through courage, sacrifice, and unity. That is true but incomplete. The colder truth sits beneath the surface. Britain also survived by spending money it did not have, and it found that money in a place that could not refuse. India, still under colonial rule, became the financial engine that kept the British war machine alive when its own reserves were fading. Think about that. An empire fighting for survival while quietly draining its largest colony to stay afloat. By the early years of the war, Britain was under immense pressure. The costs were staggering. Ships needed fuel. Factories needed raw materials. Soldiers needed food, clothing, and weapons. Every movement of the war required payment. Yet Britain's gold reserves were shrinking fast. Dollars were scarce. International creditors were watching closely. On the battlefield, Britain projected strength. Financially, it was cornered. The solution was not found in open debate or public announcements. It was found in empire. India was already integrated into Britain's economic system. Its currency, trade, and banking were tied to London. This made extraction simple and discreet. Britain could buy from India without paying immediately. It could issue promises instead of cash. Sterling credits replaced real money. On paper, everything balanced. In reality, Britain was borrowing against India's future. The mechanics were quiet but powerful. India supplied food, uniforms, metals, textiles, and industrial goods for the war effort. These were not symbolic contributions. They were essential. Indian factories worked day and night. Ports stayed crowded with ships loading cargo for distant fronts. Millions of Indian soldiers were recruited and deployed across continents. The empire framed this as shared sacrifice. Yet the financial side told a different story. Britain did not pay India in gold or hard currency. It recorded the cost as sterling balances, credits held in British accounts. These credits could not be freely used. They accumulated year after year, locked inside a system controlled entirely by London. Britain appeared solvent. Bills were paid. Trade continued. But the payment was deferred. Time was purchased. And time, during war, can be worth more than money. This arrangement did not look like theft. That is why it worked. There were no raids on vaults, no seizures announced in newspapers. There were contracts, regulations, and legal language. Everything appeared orderly. But the effect was the same as forced lending. India was compelled to finance Britain's war without knowing when, or if, it would be repaid in full. The longer the war continued, the larger the balances grew. These numbers sat quietly on balance sheets while real goods left Indian shores. Steel became tanks. Food fed armies abroad. Cloth became uniforms worn thousands of miles away. India was exporting substance and importing promises. Imagine producing everything a war requires while being told your payment must wait until the war is over. And even then, only if the empire allows it. The stakes behind the system were enormous. If Britain ran out of money, it could lose the war. A British defeat would reshape the world order. European power would fracture. Global trade routes would collapse. Rival powers would fill the vacuum. From London's perspective, survival justified extraordinary measures. But survival for whom? Every pound Britain did not spend was effectively transferred onto India's balance sheet. The cost of keeping Britain in the fight was shifted away from the imperial center and onto the colony. This was not accidental. It was strategic. Britain understood that India lacked financial sovereignty. It could not demand immediate payment. It could not convert sterling balances into dollars or gold without permission. Control of currency meant control of outcomes. To the British public, this reality remained largely invisible. Wartime narratives focused on unity and resistance. Rationing, bomb shelters, and resilience dominated the story. The empire was portrayed as contributing willingly to a shared cause. And many in India did believe they were fighting fascism alongside Britain. But belief does not equal power. The financial structure ensured that India's contribution came at a one-sided cost. While Britain preserved its limited reserves, India absorbed the economic strain. Inflation pressures grew. Domestic shortages worsened. Resources were diverted outward when they were needed at home. Yet the ledger showed no crisis. Numbers climbed neatly, giving the illusion that nothing was wrong. This is where the moral tension of the story emerges. War compresses time. Decisions made under pressure often escape scrutiny until years later. Britain's use of Indian finances was legal within the imperial system. It followed rules Britain itself had written. But legality is not the same as fairness. The central question hangs heavy even now. Can a victory still be called noble if it is financed through the slow bankruptcy of a captive economy? Britain did not simply borrow money. It borrowed agency. India could not say no. That imbalance changed everything. The war demanded resources, and the empire ensured they flowed in one direction. Inside Indian cities, the effects were subtle at first. Factories expanded, creating the appearance of growth. Employment rose in war industries. Production surged. On the surface, it looked like progress, but beneath that activity was strain. Goods were leaving faster than value returned. Domestic investment was constrained. Infrastructure projects were delayed. The economy was being stretched thin to support a conflict far beyond its borders. Wartime demand masked these pressures, but it did not eliminate them. The costs were simply postponed. Deferred payments have a way of returning with interest. Britain understood that time was its most valuable asset. Every month the war continued without financial collapse was a victory. Sterling credits bought that time. They allowed Britain to conserve gold and dollars for essential imports from abroad. They reassured allies and creditors that Britain remained stable. They kept the machinery of war running. In this sense, India did not just support the war, it underwrote it. Without Indian resources and financing, Britain's ability to fight at full scale would have been severely limited. This was the hidden foundation of wartime endurance. Yet, this foundation was built on a fragile assumption. Britain assumed it could manage the consequences later. It assumed the empire would hold. It assumed that post-war recovery would allow repayment on its own terms. Those assumptions would soon be tested. For now, during the darkest days of the war, the system appeared to work. Britain survived. Armies advanced. The narrative of resilience hardened into legend. But legends rarely account for who paid the bill. Think about the nature of this transaction. India delivered tangible goods in real time. Britain delivered accounting entries. The imbalance was not just financial. It was temporal. India gave now. Britain promised later. And later, as history often shows, is where power reveals itself. The ability to delay payment is itself a form of control. It determines who bears risk and who enjoys flexibility. In wartime, Britain held that control completely. This chapter is not about denying Britain's sacrifice or minimizing the brutality of the war. It is about expanding the frame, about looking beyond the battlefield to the balance sheet. Wars are not only fought with weapons, they are fought with currency systems, trade rules, and leverage. Britain's genius was not just military or political, it was financial. It knew how to move costs out of sight. It knew how to turn empire into a buffer against collapse. India was that buffer. As the war dragged on, the numbers continued to rise. Sterling balances accumulated quietly, becoming one of the largest forced credits in modern history. Yet there were no alarms, no headlines, just paperwork. The silence was a point. By the time the war ended, the true scale of what had been transferred would shock those who finally looked closely. But during the war, the priority was survival. And survival, Britain decided, would be financed elsewhere. This is a foundation on which the rest of the story stands. A war remembered for heroism and endurance was also a story of financial extraction and delayed reckoning. The bombs made noise. The ledgers did not. But the ledgers mattered just as much. They shaped what came after. They determined who emerged free and who emerged constrained. This chapter leaves us at the edge of that realization, with one truth firmly in place. Britain stayed alive by borrowing from a colony that had no choice. And the cost of that choice would not be settled when the war ended. To the outside world, Britain still looked unshakable. London remained the center of global finance, a city where deals were made even as air raid sirens echoed through the streets. The pound sterling still circulated across continents. Insurance markets still operated. Shipping routes still answered to British control. On maps, the empire was intact, painted confidently in red. This appearance of strength mattered. In wartime, perception is a weapon. Allies need reassurance. Creditors need confidence. Enemies need doubt. Britain understood this deeply. And so, even as its financial position weakened, the image of stability was carefully protected. This illusion was not built on speeches alone. It was enforced through systems. Britain controlled shipping lanes that connected raw materials to factories. It dominated insurance markets that decided which cargo could move safely and which could not. It governed currency flows within the empire, determining how money moved, where it paused, and when it stopped. These levers of power mattered more than armies in some moments. They allowed Britain to decide who was paid, in what currency, and under what conditions. In this structure, India was positioned not as an equal partner, but as a subordinate engine of supply. India was told it was contributing to a shared imperial struggle. The language was careful and persuasive. The war was framed as a fight for civilization, order, and freedom. Participation was presented as duty and honor. And in many ways, India did participate fully. Its factories expanded rapidly. Steel mills increased output. Textile plants worked around the clock. Ports along the coast became crowded with crates, fuel drums, and machinery bound for distant fronts. Trains carried supplies inland and soldiers outward. On the surface, this looked like economic mobilization. Production was rising. Employment was growing. Activity was everywhere. But activity is not the same as prosperity. Beneath the movement of goods and people was a financial reality few could see clearly at the time. The money that appeared to flow through the system was not cash. It was credit, and that credit was locked inside Britain's own financial architecture. Sterling balances accumulated in British accounts, not Indian ones. They could not be freely converted into dollars, gold, or other currencies needed for international trade. They could not be spent without approval from London. India was earning on paper while being constrained in practice. Imagine a shop that sells everything it produces, day after day, at full capacity. Orders keep coming. Shelves empty quickly. Workers stay busy. But the owner is told that profits cannot be withdrawn. The money exists, but only as numbers in someone else's ledger. That was the wartime Indian economy. Real goods moved out. Real labor was expended. But financial autonomy did not move in. Sterling credits replaced payment, and those credits were held under British control. From Britain's perspective, this system was efficient. Gold and dollars were scarce and strategically valuable. They were needed to purchase weapons, fuel, and supplies from countries outside the empire. By paying India in sterling, Britain conserved its hard currency reserves. It could wage total war without triggering a balance of payments crisis. The empire functioned as a closed circuit, absorbing internal costs so Britain could focus on external threats. On paper, the numbers worked. The war machine stayed funded. The pound remained stable. Confidence was maintained. This efficiency, however, depended entirely on control rather than consent. India did not choose this role freely. It was assigned. Its currency system was subordinated to imperial priorities. Its trade decisions were shaped by wartime directives issued far away. The illusion of strength Britain projected was built on this asymmetry. As long as the colony complied, the system held. But compliance under constraint is not the same as partnership, and systems built on constraint tend to crack under pressure. Inside India, the contradiction slowly became visible. Production surged, yet shortages persisted. Prices crept upward as goods were diverted abroad. Local markets tightened. Inflationary pressures built quietly. The government could not fully counter these trends because the financial tools were limited. Sterling balances could not be used freely to import food, machinery, or consumer goods from elsewhere. The economy was busy but brittle. Growth without liquidity is a dangerous condition. It creates momentum without resilience. Still, from the outside, Britain's position looked solid. The empire's scale masked internal stress. Wartime propaganda emphasized unity and contribution. The ledger entries remained invisible to most observers. Even many decision-makers focused on immediate military needs rather than long-term financial consequences. That focus was understandable. War compresses priorities. Survival comes first. Everything else is postponed. Britain postponed reckoning by postponing payment. The structure also allowed Britain to maintain leverage within the empire. By holding India's earnings in sterling, London retained bargaining power. Access to funds could be delayed, rationed, or conditioned. Financial dependency reinforced political control. Even as nationalist movements grew louder, economic constraints limited their options. The war temporarily strengthened Britain's hand, even as it weakened its long-term position. This was a paradox at the heart of imperial finance. To many British officials, the system appeared not only necessary but fair. India was part of the empire. The empire was at war. Shared sacrifice was expected. The language of obligation blurred the line between cooperation and coercion. Yet obligation without choice carries a cost. The longer the war continued, the larger that cost became. Sterling balances swelled to levels that made future repayment increasingly difficult. What began as a temporary measure hardened into a structural problem. The illusion of strength also influenced global perceptions. Allies saw Britain holding the line. Creditors saw stability. Markets saw continuity. Few questioned how this was financed. Fewer still examined the role of colonial economies in absorbing the shock. Imperial finance was complex and opaque by design. It moved costs out of sight. It delayed consequences. It turned present scarcity into future problems for someone else. India's contribution, framed as loyalty, functioned as enforced savings. Resources that could have been used for domestic development were redirected. Infrastructure projects were slowed. Investment decisions were postponed. The economy was shaped around wartime needs rather than long-term growth. These choices were not made in Indian boardrooms or parliaments. They were made within an imperial framework that prioritized Britain's survival above all else. As the war intensified, this arrangement deepened. More goods flowed outward. More credits accumulated inward. The system became self-reinforcing. Britain relied on it more heavily with each passing year. Alternatives narrowed. Once hard currency reserves were preserved using sterling credits, abandoning the system would expose financial weakness. Dependence bred further dependence. Control tightened because release carried risk. This is where illusion becomes dangerous. Strength that relies on deferred costs is not strength at all. It is leverage borrowed from the future. Britain's wartime financial posture was impressive, but it rested on a fragile base. The empire absorbed shocks that Britain could not afford to take directly. India was the largest absorber. Its size made it indispensable. Its lack of sovereignty made it vulnerable. Yet during the war, these dynamics remained largely unquestioned. Victory was the goal. Everything else was secondary. The ledger entries continued to grow, quietly recording a transfer that would one day demand resolution. For now, Britain held together. The pound held. The empire held. The illusion worked. But illusions require silence to survive. They depend on cracks staying hidden. As the war approached its turning point, that silence would become harder to maintain. The numbers were becoming too large to ignore. The promises too heavy to carry. The system that once looked brilliant would soon reveal its limits. This chapter ends with Britain still standing, still fighting, still appearing strong. The machinery of war hums on. Factories work. Ships sail. Ledgers fill. Yet beneath this motion lies a growing imbalance. Real value has moved in one direction. Control remains in another, and the distance between them is widening. The illusion holds for now, but control without consent always has an expiration date. The cracks appeared not in defeat, but in victory. As the war began to turn in Britain's favor, relief spread across the empire. The threat of collapse receded. The machinery of war slowed. But beneath that relief waited a reckoning Britain had postponed for years. The sterling balances held on India's behalf had grown enormous. They were no longer abstract figures. They represented real claims on Britain's future resources. And Britain was in no position to meet them easily. The war had been survived, but at a cost that could not be hidden forever. Britain emerged from the conflict exhausted. Cities were damaged. Infrastructure was strained. Foreign reserves were thin. The global economy was shifting, and Britain's dominance within it was weakening. In this fragile moment, releasing India's sterling balances posed a serious risk. Converting those credits into usable currency would mean flooding the system with demand Britain could not satisfy. Inflation would rise. Confidence in the pound could falter. Capital might flee. Britain faced a stark choice: honor the full value of what India was owed, or manage the fallout by slowing, limiting, and reshaping repayment. The decision was cautious, deliberate, and revealing. Britain chose delay. Payments were postponed. Access to funds was restricted. Sterling balances were negotiated, converted, or reclassified under complex arrangements. The language was technical, but the effect was simple. India could not freely use the money it had earned. The credits existed, but they remained trapped. Britain framed this as economic prudence. Stability had to be preserved. Recovery required discipline. But for India, this discipline felt like confinement. This was the core mechanism of extraction finally laid bare. During the war, India had been compelled to save for Britain. After the war, it was told to wait. Forced savings became frozen savings. Funds that could have been used to rebuild industries, import machinery, or stabilize prices were kept out of reach. India's economy entered the post-war world burdened by shortages and constraints, despite having financed a global victory. The cause and effect chain was brutal and clear. Wartime diversion led to post-war scarcity. Deferred payment led to delayed development. Inside India, the pressure mounted. Factories that had expanded for war faced uncertainty. Demand shifted, but capital remained locked. Inflation rose as supplies struggled to meet domestic needs. Investment stalled. Trust eroded. The economy had been stretched outward for years, and now it struggled to reorient inward. This was not mismanagement by chance. It was a predictable result of a system designed to prioritize imperial stability over colonial resilience. Britain, meanwhile, defended its position with urgency. Officials argued that sudden repayment would harm both sides. A destabilized pound would disrupt trade. Global confidence would suffer. Gradual release, they insisted, was responsible. Negotiations unfolded in rooms filled with fine print and power imbalance. India needed its money to stand on its own feet. Britain needed time to recover without losing financial credibility. Only one side controlled the timetable. This imbalance marked a moral turning point. During the war, extraordinary measures could be justified by existential threat. After victory, those justifications weakened. The continuation of restrictions revealed that the system was not temporary. It was structural. Britain's survival strategy had become India's long-term burden. The empire had shifted from protection to paralysis. What had been framed as shared sacrifice now looked like enforced dependency. Ask yourself what happens when a nation wins a war but loses financial sovereignty. Political independence without economic control is a fragile state. India was approaching that reality. As demands for self-rule intensified, the financial constraints became impossible to ignore. The sterling issue was no longer just an accounting problem. It was a symbol. It represented years of extraction, delayed justice, and limited agency. The numbers in British ledgers now carried political weight. The negotiations themselves reflected this tension. Britain approached them as a manager balancing risks. India approached them as a creditor demanding access. The language of partnership clashed with the reality of hierarchy. Each delay reinforced the sense that economic power remained concentrated in London. Even as political authority weakened, Britain could still say no. It could still set conditions. That leverage mattered. Globally, the environment was changing. New financial systems were emerging. Old empires were being questioned. Britain's insistence on control began to look outdated. The very tools that had sustained it during the war now highlighted its limits. Imperial finance was losing legitimacy, yet relinquishing it carried costs Britain feared it could not afford. The result was hesitation, compromise, and prolonged uncertainty. For India, the consequences were immediate and personal. Development plans stalled. Social pressures increased. The promise of independence was shadowed by economic constraint. Freedom arrived carrying debts not of its own making. The sterling balances, once a sign of contribution, became a reminder of imbalance. They showed how deeply the war had reshaped India's economic trajectory. This chapter is the turning point of the story. It is where the quiet mechanisms of wartime finance collide with post-war reality. The illusion of temporary measures dissolves. The cost of deferred payment becomes visible. Britain's control, once justified by emergency, now stands exposed as leverage. And India's position shifts from silent supporter to constrained claimant. Victory did not resolve these tensions. It intensified them. The war had been won, but the financial settlement was still unfolding. Britain needed stability. India needed autonomy. The system could not satisfy both fully. The decisions made in this period would shape decades to come. By delaying repayment, Britain bought itself time once more. But time was no longer neutral. Each delay deepened mistrust. Each restriction reinforced the perception that imperial finance was incompatible with a changing world. The balance of power was shifting, not through armies, but through credibility. This is where the story leaves us in this chapter. A war concluded, but its economic shadow lengthening. Sterling balances sitting like unresolved debts between a fading empire and a rising nation. Control still held, but increasingly contested. The mechanisms that once looked clever now looked heavy. And the question that lingered was no longer about survival, but about legitimacy. Who had the right to decide when a debt would be paid? The aftermath reshaped both nations in ways no battlefield victory could ever fully explain. Britain emerged on the winning side of history, but it did so financially drained and structurally weakened. The war preserved the state, yet hollowed out the empire that sustained it. The very mechanisms that allowed Britain to survive the conflict now accelerated its decline. Imperial finance, once a source of strength, became a liability in a world that no longer accepted quiet extraction and delayed justice. One by one, the pillars that upheld British dominance began to give way. For India, independence arrived wrapped in contradiction. Political freedom was achieved, but economic freedom lagged behind. The newly sovereign state inherited an economy shaped by years of forced wartime priorities and post-war financial restraint. Development was delayed not by lack of effort or ambition, but by the absence of usable capital. Sterling balances still hung over the relationship like unresolved promises. Choices were narrowed from the start. Investment decisions had to be cautious. Imports were constrained. Industrial expansion moved slower than it should have. The cost of financing a global war was being paid long after the victory celebrations ended. Britain, facing its own crisis, began to dismantle the empire piece by piece. This was not an act of sudden generosity. It was necessity. Maintaining imperial control was no longer affordable. The financial burden outweighed the benefits. The world was changing, and old systems could not survive new expectations. Britain learned a harsh lesson. Power built on control of money, rather than consent, does not endure. Influence can be delayed but not preserved when credibility erodes. This was not a dramatic collapse. There were no riots in the streets of London demanding the end of empire. No single moment when the system visibly snapped. Instead, influence drained away quietly. One negotiation at a time. One concession at a time. Britain adjusted to a reduced role on the global stage, trading dominance for stability. The empire faded not in flames but in paperwork. India's trajectory, shaped by these constraints, reflected the long shadow of imperial finance. A nation that had financed victory began its independent life under economic pressure. Growth was possible, but harder. Autonomy existed, but within limits set by history. The Sterling scandal left scars no parade could hide. It demonstrated how deeply financial systems can shape political outcomes. How power exercised through currency can outlast power exercised through force. And this story does not end in the 1940s. Its mechanics remain painfully familiar. Today, power is still exercised through debt, delayed payments, and controlled access to capital. Nations are rarely conquered by armies alone. They are constrained by financial systems that dictate timelines, priorities, and choices. Control the money, and you control the future. Control the timeline, and you control the outcome. History teaches that wars are not only won on battlefields. They are financed in back rooms, justified in ledgers, and paid for long after the guns fall silent. The real cost is often carried by those who never chose a conflict, who never proved the terms, and who were never given the option to refuse. Britain survived the war. India paid a hidden price. That imbalance is the heart of the story. If you want to understand how power really works in the modern world, you have to look beyond flags and speeches. You have to follow the money. If this story helped you see history differently, subscribe for more cinematic explorations of power, economics, and hidden systems. And share this documentary with anyone who believes wars end when the fighting stops.